manufacturing is gone in America. Even though manufacturing is still a $2.3, $2.4 trillion industry, right? It employs 12 million, 13 million people. It would be the seventh largest country in the world if U.S. manufacturing was its own economic GDP. Like, it's still massive. And so my whole goal of how I turn it into a business is how do we better advocate and celebrate manufacturing? And so I work with associations, I work with robotic and manufacturing companies, and I work with trade shows then to promote and drive awareness around.
You're an evangelist.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So we need more of them.
Yeah, he's got the charisma to do it too.
So I just my whole job
About
is
30 seconds, guys.
is
right?
being able just to travel around the United States and really the world now and just talk about manufacturing.
So you're traveling all the time?
Yeah.
That's
I do
great.
about 40, 45 events a year.
Oh, wonderful. That's fantastic.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun.
Did you have fun in Asia as well as just work?
I mean, I have little kids, like you were mentioning, so I travel with them sometimes, but this one I was on my own. And
All right, guys, ready?
You should go to the IREX show in Tokyo.
I normally don't go to shows unless I'm like.
Hello, everyone.
Anyway.
Can you hear me? Welcome to the Reautomated Podcast, live from the Collaborate event in Novi, Michigan. I'm your host, Chris Savoia from Universal Robots. Today we have two very special guests, Jake Hall, known as the Manufacturing Millennial, and Ben Armstrong, who's the Executive Director of MIT's Industrial Performance Center. Both have been guests on the Reautomated Podcast before. Both are very influential voices in our industry, and I'm very excited today to have them together to explore their insights on the future of manufacturing. So gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Ben, we'll start with you. Your research focuses on industrial productivity, innovation, competitiveness, including how workers and firms adapt to change. Can you briefly introduce yourself and your work at MIT?
Sure. I've been interested for some time now on manufacturing productivity, particularly in the United States, but also around the world. And one of the major puzzles, really, for me and for my colleagues, is why American manufacturing productivity has been declining since 2010. We had a 50-year run of pretty remarkable increases in productivity, and then for some reason, about 15 years ago now, there was a reversal. And that reversal went along with some other things. U.S. manufacturing firms stopped adopting new technology, investing significantly in new technology, and wages also flattened. So there was it seemed to be three pieces of the puzzle. One was the firms themselves. Why did they stop taking risks and investing in new technology in ways that they'd been doing for the past 50 or so years? The second was people. Why was it that people didn't seem to be gaining new skills and moving into higher wage jobs? And then the third was technology. Why weren't these firms investing in technologies that we knew from a variety of research could help them become more productive and more competitive on the global stage, like the technologies that you see here today that UR provides? So that combination of questions, why are these pieces, how do they fit together to lead to declining productivity, and how might that story really turn around and we see in productivity? That's what really I focus on in my work.
Following as the Manufacturing Millennial, in part by breaking down the question, why aren't more people working in the industrial sector? So why do you think that people have gravitated to your movement so much?
Yeah, I mean, it's a compliment of what Ben's doing, right? My passion is how do we get younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs, excited about the industry? Workforce is a problem that pretty much every manufacturing company is struggling with right now. And on top of that, many people are struggling with how do they correctly use, integrate technology. And I think there's something special that comes with younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs. They're really tech savvy. They've grown up and truly integrated their lives with getting access to information right away, being able to self-learn through video, through online forums. And they have really an amazing mentality of not being afraid to fail and being able to continuously learn it. And technology is a way for them to enable to continually learn to make an impact into manufacturing companies. So a lot of manufacturing companies don't know where to start when it comes to technology. And so many days, you look at a product like Universal Robots that has a tablet. My 4-year-old daughter knows how to navigate a tablet better than my father does, who is a baby boomer. And so I see this massive opportunity with being able to introduce this technology to a younger generation, which will be ready to then integrate it into our workforce, which is hopefully what is going to solve our productivity issues that we've been seeing struggle with for so long.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really looking forward to having kind of the evangelist and the researcher, weighing on two different sides of really the same coin. So feel free to challenge each other as much as you need to. Ben, you've said that America is facing a productivity crisis in manufacturing. Can you explain a little bit of the history that you've researched as well as the current state of productivity and what can be done to improve it?
In each major productivity boom in the United States, and even you can look at Asian productivity booms, there's been kind of a technology enabler. We saw initially in the late 1800s, replaceable parts technology enabled this big boom in US manufacturing. At that point, we were stealing technology designs from Europe, stole the bicycle, stole the internal combustion engine, then we'd scale up production in the US based on our superior machine tools. And what really enabled that technology to diffuse was skilled labor. It was early machinists who, mostly in New England, learned how to use these tools really effectively and then could outcompete their peers overseas. Then the second wave, really here in Eastern Michigan, was enabled by tool makers and early industrial engineers to scale mass production techniques. And today I think that we have an abundance of really exciting technologies that have yet to diffuse. I think one of the key things to unlock would be what's the new class of worker that could really help those technologies diffuse. There isn't the equivalent of a tool maker or a machinist from previous eras that's been scaled up. So that is one of the things that I've been focusing on is like, what's the workforce yin to the maybe the robotics yang here that could help improve productivity, help some of the technologies you see here diffuse out into the market. I mean, it is, to me, a real problem that only 12% of American factories have any robotic automation at all. I mean, that's really a striking figure, and that number has pretty much been flat for about the last 15 years. The level of robot installations has been flat since maybe 2010, 2012, and that's similar in Japan, it's similar in Korea, it's similar in Germany. They started at a higher level, but robot installations have been flat. The technology's been getting better. Why haven't installations been going up? I think it's fundamentally a skill and a workforce problem.
What do you think? Is the answer to that a new wave or age of automation engineers?
I think so. What we're learning right now, robot 20 years ago. In many ways, you had to have a degree engineer who understood it wasn't just simply deploying an automation solution, it was the full integration of it in order to be able to deploy a robot on the floor, where now all of a sudden you see kids who are, I'll give you an example, there's a high school program, KCTC in West Michigan in Grand Rapids, that has, I think, 16 UR3s. And here you have juniors in high school learning how to program, integrate a robot with sensors, with safety, with vision, with end-of-arm tooling, and all of a sudden they can graduate from high school with the degrees necessary and the skill sets necessary to then deploy automation. I'm 100% in agreement with Ben where the technology is there, but I would say the reason why in many cases we haven't deployed robotics at scale is because we simply don't have the workforce that's readily available and knowledgeable in a lot of times to make that ease of integration. If every company in-house knew how to deploy robots internally, you look at the cost factor of integration, you would see a lot more robots being used. And I think leveraging and getting a future workforce excited is what's necessary. And it's through education, it's through partnerships, it's through collaboration between being able to take a Zimmer or an on-robot or a shunt gripper and easily tie it into a robot that ties into a vision system that can even tie into some sort of simulation software where you don't even have to program the robot. You can go online and simulate that program and then just plug your robot in, download that software and just deploy it. That's what's just going to make things a lot easier and hopefully drive more productivity at scale.
So Jake, you've been talking at length about the challenges of attracting millennials and all this stuff, and as you just said, you started the Manufacturing Millennial about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
In that 5 years, what have you seen change to right now? Do you think it's progressing, it's trending, or as Ben states, is it kind of staying flat?
Well, I think there's different areas that you could track. When you look from the education side of things, I would say we're growing. It's amazing where I hear stories every single year of robots and automation cells being deployed in high schools, being deployed in local community colleges, at universities, education centers, right? There's dozens of partners that are deploying this skill set. So I would say there's a younger workforce that's more capable than ever before to deploy automation. And I think it a lot of times starts with them. But when you look at the general industry as a whole, there's so many amazing wins that you look at. I was in Omaha, Nebraska 2 weeks ago at the Lincoln Poultry Farm production facility where they're processing 400,000 chickens a day. So if you ever go to Costco and you get your $5 rotisserie chicken or your boneless chicken, it's coming out of Omaha, Nebraska. Yeah. And when I was talking with one of the floor managers that were there, they're deploying automation at massive scales. They have several dozen robots on the floor already. They want to put 80 more robots on their production line in the next 18 months. So you see a lot of new industry adopting automation. And where we might not see traditional productivity in certain industries, we are seeing a massive growth in productivity in others. I mean, I think of it as my wife's shopping habits, where she buys from Amazon, right? And all of a sudden, you look at 3 or 4 years ago, and a two-day delivery was just this mind-blowing thing. Back when I was a kid, it took a couple of weeks to get what you wanted on the floor, and all of a sudden you can get it there. And I can even get same-day delivery from Amazon. If I buy by 9 a.m., it will be at my door by 4 or 5. That is because they have, I think, just the facility in Grand Rapids, a couple hundred robots that are making that productivity at scale. So while there are a lot of areas that when you look at general manufacturing across the board where it might be lined, I would say there are definitely industries that are growing, and the food and bev space, the production space, the warehouse space, that we are seeing a lot of amazing, growth opportunities.
That's great. Ben, what do you think?
I think that the Amazon example here is instructive, where Amazon had this really path-breaking innovation when it came to automation, is that they were using software to make robots much more flexible on Amazon fulfillment center floors. So they had used the guy who set up the fulfillment center network, chemical engineer by training, had worked at Allied Signal, and he realized he could apply the same theory of constraints that many manufacturers use to a warehouse facility. He could use the same robotic automation principles, and ultimately the game changer for Amazon was they had this huge team of software engineers that could apply automation but extremely flexibly based on the commands of their internally developed software applications. So now what I think is exciting is that the same gentleman who developed that system has become invested in American manufacturing. He's bought up with a group about 13 different factories in the U.S. and is now trying to bring the innovations that Amazon pioneered in the warehouse and fulfillment space back to kind of aerospace machine shops. He makes composite materials in some of these factories, consumer goods, and what I think is exciting is applying some of these principles in the composite space. For example, he's now exporting composites to China for assembly because he can make these components less expensively than the Chinese can in their manual composite layup process. So it's when you do this well, it can be very competitive, and you can see big productivity gains. But I think some of the ideas for how to do this well can come from outside manufacturing.
There's two interesting thoughts that I have to that, Ben. One is Amazon benefited from being able to greenfield and design in a lot of this stuff. So how do you apply that to existing manufacturing? And then two, back to Jake's point, where do you think the delta is? You're talking about a private individual investing, to realize these gains, but where does this come in with the public policy and actually being able to influence broad scale education for people that's going to matter for everyone? You know what I mean? So maybe
Can I start with the second one? Yeah. Okay. I think the risk. So I look at that. This private individual who has a lot of capital and has a lot of wealthy friends can mobilize to buy up a bunch of factories and apply these ideas. That's an exciting model, but it doesn't scale very well. And I think one of the things you might love it or hate it. If you look at Tesla, could Tesla happen just in the market, in the public markets? Absolutely not. It relied on Department of Energy support. It relied on a billionaire with a screw loose to provide capital when the capital might not have otherwise been available. So the question is, that's a company that's developed a lot of really interesting new technologies that their peers and competitors have then adopted. How do we support that? either through public policy or through the market. Right now, traditional private equity isn't going to support that type of firm. The timeline is too short term. So what are the alternative models? I think one model is in venture capital. The traditional software venture capital isn't going to work, but we've seen these adjusted venture capital models. Eclipse, if some of you have come across Eclipse or Eclipse companies, they've taken a lot of Tesla, people who were burned out from Tesla or SpaceX, who learned this really interesting approach to manufacturing and have funded their spin-outs. So now you have this, just like the Traitorous 8 came out of Fairchild Semiconductor and the horrors of William Shockley, now you get, not necessarily traitorous, but you have a bunch of Tesla and SpaceX spin-outs that come out with a very different approach and greenfield approach to manufacturing solutions funded by venture capital. And then you get this other financial model that looks a little bit like Danaher, and how Danaher has been able to maintain a diversified conglomerate as a publicly traded company in the U.S. Very rare. We were talking about Japanese companies, companies, because they have this Keiretsu model of shared corporate governance, they can be very diversified and learn from the different bodies of the company. I was mentioning that Mitsubishi, they make pens, they make Uniball pens, and the same technology that allows them to make these pens that write very effectively and don't smudge, they're now applying to batteries for their automotive division, because the chemistry of the ink is now applicable to lithium-ion batteries. That's not really available for a lot of US companies that have been pressured to be more pure play, focused just on one comparative advantage in the public markets. But a Danaher model, the same model that Jeff Wilke, who used to lead Amazon Consumer, that he's applying at his company Rebuild Manufacturing, those are, I think, interesting and in many ways exciting alternative ways of managing risk. Now, we can get into kind of government policies, whether they've supported this. Government's put a lot of money in the last 4 or 5 years into manufacturing. It hasn't solved that risk, the de-risking problem at its core. It's kind of looked at, it's been a series of very gold-plated Band-Aids, but not really a core solution.
To add to that as well, I think it was 2 questions ago, but you talked about software. Mm-hmm. And I think when you look at manufacturing for the last century, manufacturing was a very physical-based process. Mm-hmm. And when your question was, what is exciting you over the next 5 years, I would say manufacturing is becoming just as much of a software solution as it is a physical one. When you look at all of the recent advancements that when it comes to robotics, when it comes to automation, it hasn't been so much on the physical side as it has been the software side. From being able to take an ecosystem that we were talking about, where you have 500 partners here as the URCAP program, a lot of that works because of the software solution that's behind what UR is pushing out. So if it's through machine vision, if it's through automation, if it's through the way we're programming these days with no-code, low-code solutions, if it's what NVIDIA is pushing out on their simulation side through Isaac Sim, software in a lot of ways is enabling technology that we've never been able to see before, which is what I'm really hoping is what could be the next push for productivity.
Yeah, and I'll say to that point, I think a big part of making software work is having access to communities, to be able to, having individuals that can go out and ask questions and things like that. I've always believed that UR does a very good job of fostering a sense of community, whether it's through their developer suite and kind of writing code for them, or whether it's like actually deploying robots and building them. Part of it is coming back to the ecosystem, as you said. But I know that you've been an outspoken advocate for using community to kind of pass along the tribal knowledge that comes with building an automation project. Yeah. So what do you have kind of to say to that point, or advice that you have for a manufacturer to pass on the tribal knowledge that they get?
Yeah, I mean, it goes in multiple steps, right? I think the first thing is you need to get a younger generation into the door of manufacturing. So, one thing I always encourage every manufacturing company is, what are you doing to reach either your next generation of customers or your future employees? So one thing that's coming up in about a month and a half that we're doing in West Michigan, and it happens here in East Michigan as well, is My Career Quest. We're busing in 8,500 high school students to meet with manufacturers for a day at a massive convention center. And so we're going to have 60 manufacturers that are showcasing all these different automation and manufacturing processes to teach these kids to say, hey, the perception that you're being told around manufacturing being this dark, dirty, dull, dangerous, dumb industry isn't true. Where you might have guidance counselors in high school saying, no, you need to go get a 4-year degree because that's the only way you're going to be labeled of getting success, might not necessarily be true. For me, I went to college. I got an engineering degree. I graduated with $54,000 in student debt. And that was one of those things where my guidance counselor at the time basically said, a 4-year degree is the only option for you. And where a 4-year degree is amazing. We need research. We need people to go get engineering degrees. There are so many other opportunities through like GRCC, which is local community college we have in West Michigan, where you can go and get a 2-year associate's degree in mechatronics or robotic programming or being a PLC or a software programmer, right? There's so many other opportunities that exist. And all those education programs are only possible by manufacturers investing in those programs. So when you look at My Career Quest, that event costs us $250,000 to run. Between running the facility, getting all of the exhibition hall set up, paying for all the busing, paying for the volunteer, for the time to do that, and then setting up volunteers. It's a very expensive opportunity, but it wouldn't be possible unless manufacturers are investing in that. Another great example where we have another event called Discover Manufacturing in October during Manufacturing Week every year. That one, we bring about 13,000 middle school and high school students into manufacturers over about a 2.5-week period of time. So we pull them out of school at 8:30 in the morning. They get on a bus. They'll go visit a manufacturer in the morning. They'll have lunch. They'll go visit another manufacturer in the afternoon, and they'll come back home. And for them, it's about so many students wouldn't understand what you as a manufacturer, what you as a company are doing unless they go see it in person. Now, I'm trying to make mainstream leveraging social media to showcase manufacturing. So that's what I do on LinkedIn or YouTube or TikTok. My average video on TikTok gets somewhere between 1 and 3 million views. Yeah. Talking about manufacturing. So it's massive that way, but it has to be hit on multiple fronts. And I think when we can showcase the technology that manufacturers have, when they walk into a floor and they say, oh, look at this robot operation. Look how clean things are. You know what? Maybe it's not one of those things that we're being told jobs went overseas 30 years ago, they don't exist anymore, because that's the experience that their parents or their grandparents had working for a manufacturer. They say, you know what? There's this, revitalization that's happening in the manufacturing front, and they need to see it in person.
Yeah, you've said to me once, kids don't want to walk down a manufacturing floor and see Windows 97.
Yeah.
They want to see something better. From what I'm hearing you say is that you, as an evangelist, are trying to make manufacturing sexy.
Absolutely, and make it fun, right? And really the goal is how do we correlate what young kids in middle school and high school are already doing to the manufacturing space. For example, I think in 2020 or 2021, 33 million 3D printers were sold in the United States. And a majority of those were purchased by middle school and high school kids. But that was put out there. And so you look at a middle school or high school student can go online, they can design something free on Autodesk or AutoCAD or Fusion 360 or Onshape, or SolidWorks. They can go out there, they can design it, they can then slice it up with the software, then they can use a manufacturing process of additive manufacturing. So you have my nephew, he's 12 years old, and he 3D printed his own robot and then found code on GitHub to then program a robot by himself. And you look at what's separate, what does this next generation need to see? They're already familiar with how to make things on their own and how to be their own engineer. We just need to connect that with what they are learning at home, then with saying, hey, you could take those talents and now put them in the real world and get paid for it.
Yeah, very cool. Do you think that cobots in particular help that message of making things sexier again for manufacturing?
I would say collaborative robots made a lot of older robot manufacturers wake up and saying you need to program robots differently in order to reach a younger generation, right? Because you would go out there and you would look at a teach pennant, and that teach pennant hasn't changed for 20, 30, 40 years. By the same buttons, the same black and white screen, and it was one of those things where Universal Robots came to the market with a touchscreen with an iPad as, my daughter, when she picks up a UR controller and programs it, they say, you know what, now all of a sudden, another generation who's never used robots before can take a robot and start programming a robot in 10 minutes. And then all of a sudden, if a young kid can, or even an adult can immediately do something, it doesn't seem like such a risk to them. It doesn't seem like it's an out of reach solution for them to integrate on the floor. And I think, that's what the collaborative robot market brought to the industry, was saying, hey, we're able to democratize a lot of manufacturing processes that were once very expensive or difficult to integrate.
Yeah. Ben, I can almost feel you holding your tongue right now, because I think you've said to me before, actually maybe to that point that Jake made, well, a lot of people aren't even using the Teach Bennett, so.
I've seen a lot of URs in the wild, and I very, very rarely see any Teach Bennett being used. I think so. I look at the education problem a little differently. So I have a few questions for you, Jake, following up. One, it sounds like you're appealing to students among the masses. So you really want this to be everyone to feel like they have access to manufacturing and that they would have more access to more excited jobs. I feel, and this is not a very popular view, policymakers don't like it, but when I go to factories, and I'm not really focused on the best outcomes for individuals, I just wonder, how do our factories compete in the United States? And the most competitive factories, it's not because they have the best team and everyone's contributing equally to the team. They have a few star players in their factories. And they have someone who's maybe an expert machine builder. They have someone who's maybe great with software. And they have someone who just knows the process and can visualize how the process can be improved. So my big question is, how do we train more of those people? Because even at MIT, our engineering education isn't producing those people right now. Those kind of top performers, the mechanical savants out there in manufacturing. And we don't really have any great vocational schools to train those people. So right now, the only way that we get those people in American factories is they somehow figure it out on their own. And they realize that they have this genius in them, and they become discovered somehow. So I think that the success in our workforce would be if we get a bunch of, maybe you with your children or a bunch of my colleagues and their children, they would be excited for them to go to a vocational school that produces those extremely high performers in manufacturing. Not necessarily a degreed engineer, but someone who really makes a huge impact on the factory floor. So I think back to one of these machine builder types that I met in Colorado, who's just extraordinarily talented, and he was a political science major in college, never really pursued it, and then ended up, building these incredible automated cells with old Motoman robots he found at auction. And I said, so what should we be doing? How do we train more people like you? And he said, well, there's no Carnegie Mellon of vocational schools. There's no Stanford of community colleges. There's no MIT. There's no real prestige where you're just. Some people might be excited, but I, for example, would want to feel really proud and excited if my kids went to vocational school because that was their dream and that it would lead to a prestigious career with a lot of dignity. And we don't have that yet. So I feel like that is one missing piece of how do you really train the top workforce that's required to implement a lot of these technologies, not just the masses, which I think our community colleges are equipped to do, but not necessarily to do the elite, like the Navy SEALs of
They're allowing that stratification for people.
That's the whole mandate of our community college and junior college system, is to ensure access to the masses. And I think that there's a great role for that. That's how funding's established. That is how public education in many cases is supposed to work. But there also needs to be an alternative that helps the workforce really excel.
Should get together to start that.
There you go.
We're working on it at MIT. We'd love to have you.
And I think of it as well, it's a numbers game at the end of the day, right? Where I think the more people that we can get familiarized with robotics or automation, we might find that one student that is that Carnegie Mellon prodigy that can bring that solution of that area, right? And there's all these amazing incubators that are out there through Pittsburgh Robotics out in Pittsburgh, and this, Mass Robotics out in Massachusetts, and Silicon Valley Robotics. So there are these amazing organizations that are helping enable people come up when they have these great ideas to go out and get funding. You mentioned the venture capital is an amazing, solution as well. But I think at the end of the day, we look at it as the more students that we can get introduced to this, the more we can hopefully find that one person that just goes and looks at a manufacturing floor, and she's 16 years old. She walks through a cell and says, you know what? I think I could make something that does something better like that. And then the whole idea is we need to inspire these kids to be able to see it. And if they never see it, if that one gentleman who lives out in Colorado never saw that opportunity to go find those robots, he might not be making those amazing solutions today.
Yeah. So part of me wonders. We have a lot of these extreme. I think the talent is there. in the workforce. It's only the problem is that these people are working at Meta or they're working at Google. They're getting paid a lot for jobs that I don't think are providing that much impact. And really, we need to pull them back into manufacturing where they would have been maybe in a previous generation. So maybe that's a different recruitment pitch than the one to the masses.
But it's a very good pitch, though.
Yeah.
You know, you look at so many people within the engineering side, when the whole entire computer science degree really took off, within universities, you had a lot of people who were electrical engineers decided to say, I like to program, or computer engineers, I'm going to go to the computer science side, and I'm going to go work for a .com or an app company and work from home and make $350,000 a year. Why would I want to go work for a manufacturer that might be paying half that?
Yeah, but I think there's a wage problem, right? Yeah. There's a wage problem mostly at the bottom end, in some cases in engineering as well. But I think about the very well-covered stories of attempted lights out automation, right? And I think that like the UR perspective would be you shouldn't go for lights out, you should go for more practical automation. But I think about one tool maker that tried to develop a lights out factory in the South, and it's totally failed, right? They tried to set up the factory, it collapsed within a matter of months, and it was a disaster for the company. And they looked back and they tried to figure out, why did this happen? Like, did we get the math wrong? Could we not have developed it? And they said, no, they were confident actually that they had the tooling, the math was right, that they could actually, with this automated system, produce tools less expensively in the US, in the South, than they could in China. The issue was they just didn't have the technical talent to operate the system, and that's where it broke down. Their talent wasn't ready. And I think there it's like maybe it's worth spending 10 to 20% more on recruiting, on training the talent to ensure that it can get off the ground, and then maybe you can help absorb that cost later. But it's the talent that really seems to be the choke point.
I'll give you an example of this. We talked about this in our preview call earlier. So when I was doing the Discover Manufacturing Tour 2 years ago, there was a machine builder that we toured that just deployed a couple of collaborative robot cells. And when I was talking with the owner there, they talked about how they have like 15 or 16 employees in this machine shop. And 30% of their business was for a large tier 2 automotive company down in Kalamazoo, Michigan. If you know them, you probably know who I'm talking about. But they were looking at shopping out a lot of those products overseas. Yeah. Well, the owner of the shop's kid was in was on a FIRST robotics team. And part of that FIRST robotics team is they did a tour of, I think, it was like JR Automation out in Holland, Michigan, and the kids saw a bunch of robots running around. And so he went back home to talk to his dad and said, hey, Dad, you should put in robots to run your Haas machines at nighttime so you can get more productivity. This kid still in high school helped deploy their robot solutions to then run lights out, well, not full lights out operation, but machine tending to keep them in business and keep that job here in the United States where it would have went overseas. So when you talk about how do we enable a workforce, that kid saw it because he was on a FIRST robotics team, getting a tour of a local automation integrated machine builder, said, I can do that. And then he deployed it at his dad's shop, which you could argue that set of, I think, 3 robots they bought could have saved 8 jobs here in the United States because those robots kept them in business. And so there's stories that go each way, but I think it's always good to highlight the success stories that happen, as to say, look, here's this kid who's not even in the workforce yet, who's in high school, that said, I can do that, and now all of a sudden they're running, at a much more efficient level with robots.
So Ben, I want to point to 3 reports that you've published over the last 3 years. You've obviously been busy. The first one was the puzzle of the missing robots from 2022. The second one was a smarter strategy for using robots from 23, which I think had a Harvard Business Review article come about from it, some notoriety. And then finally this year, automation from the worker's perspective in 2024. So in your research, you're using these reports as a method to get out your message. With your experience now, what are the top 2 to 3 reasons, say, that why automation would fail at a firm? Just to make it very clear for everyone.
I might give you the flip side of why automation succeeds, given Jake's invitation to be more optimistic. One of the things that we're both interested in the workforce component. So a project we did, the automation from the worker's perspective, came out late last year. We did a survey of 9,000 workers across 9 different countries, and we were trying to understand perceptions of automation among the workforce. Really, we had heard these stories on the ground of workers resisting or not being prepared to deploy automation, or maybe they're prepared for one automated system that maybe an integrator comes and sets up, but the workers internally can't scale it up. So we asked workers, what impact do you think automation has had on your job? What kind of tasks do you do on a day-to-day basis? That sort of thing. What kind of technologies do you interact with? And we found a few things that I found interesting. One, the US is the most pessimistic about automation of all the countries we studied by far. The only country that has a net negative score about the impact of automation on jobs and wages is the US. France, of all places, is like 20 percentage points net positive. Poland, 30 percentage points net positive. Japan, similarly, right? The US is an outlier in its pessimism. Why is that the case? I'm not quite sure. I think one reason it might be media narratives that are very pessimistic about new technology. One might be the lack of a strong social safety net, and a lot of in France and Germany, where they're not afraid of robots threatening their job security at all, whereas in the U.S. maybe job security is just more top of mind. So that's one component, is the U.S. is an outlier. Another component that I thought was really interesting, we had expected that the workers who would be resistant to automation would be the workers who do the most routine tasks. They're the babysitting a machine now. Once the robot does machine tending, what are they going to do? So we asked workers, how often do you do routine tasks? How often do you do problem solving? And we found that the routine tasks, the level of routineness in a worker's job, wasn't actually predictive of how they thought about robots. It was the level of problem solving. That actually the most optimistic workers, they had high levels of routine tasks and high levels of problem solving. So the workers were ready, like, hey, take away my routine tasks, I can focus on this cognitive work.
Makes sense.
Whereas workers with high levels of routine tasks but low problem solving, they were the most pessimistic. So it really seemed to be this is like academia 101, just set up a survey that states the obvious. But maybe this is obvious to some people, but you can redesign a job to have more problem solving, and workers might be more willing to invite and welcome the robot and help scale it up. So that was a finding that we really we found exciting that came out of that. We also ran this experiment around incentives, and I've been a big proponent of worker level incentives for adopting automation, that when workers become more productive at the individual level, they should get bonuses. And some of the most successful companies with automation are employee owned and have profit sharing programs, because then the workers are super bought in. They want to find out a way to run that machine lights out and to extract additional value from it. So I think that's really kind of an exciting. We found really strong results when we offered incentives, even in a hypothetical survey setting, for how workers thought about robotics.
So those are all strategies to succeed,
kind
of with integrations. Where do you see people fail then? Lack of champions. I know maybe this goes back to some of your prior research, but
I mean, it's tough. It's a lot of firms that end up not adopting, and it's sort of a dog that didn't bark problem. There's a lot of reasons why the dog might not have barked. It's easier to observe it when it happens. So the one thing that we have begun studying is we call the second robot problem. So thanks to data from UR, but also International Federation of Robotics data, we've been able to learn that only among companies that adopt one robot, it's actually quite rare for them to scale up to a second. A lot of robots get in the hardware version of pilot purgatory. A lot of companies, I should say, get in the robotic version of pilot purgatory. So one of our questions is, it's clear if you've bought one robot that you're open to automation and you think that it might have some value within your firm. It's also quite likely that if you buy a robot for machine tending, you probably have another machine that's available to tend. So why don't you adopt another robot? We also know that when companies scale up their robot use, applies across countries. They're more profitable, more productive. They hire more workers actually when they scale up robot use. So what's the deal? Why aren't they scaling up? And there's no offense here to any of the integrators in the room. I think a lot of it comes down to internal skills and the internal ability within your workforce to identify the right processes, to have the process knowledge to say, I can re-engineer this process around a robotic cell versus just doing it the way I've always done it. So there's a little bit of internal skills there, and there's also a risk element. Like, am I willing to take the risk of re-engineering this process, not knowing exactly how much new productivity I'm going to gain? So the scaled up robot users, one of the main things that differentiates them beyond skill is also a tolerance for risk and experimentation. And I would say that the lack of adoption is also just a status quo bias. Hey, I'm doing well, I'm profitable where I'm at. Why would I mess with the process that's working and add a robot?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, let's transition, guys, and talk a little bit. You got to pull out your crystal balls now. talk about the future of manufacturing. So both of you have unique perspectives on the future of manufacturing. What do you see as the biggest trends shaping the industry over the next decade? Jake, you go first.
Yeah, I would say we are going to see a lot more simulation-based robotics. When I think really the next robotic wave is going to come out where we can put a process into a NVIDIA Isaac Sim simulation, and we can go out there without the need of having to program a robot. We can run tens of thousands of different simulations on how we're going to grasp, how we're going to move that component, and it's going to find the best way to deploy it. Now, is it available right now? No. 5 years from now, 2 years from now? No. Probably 10, 15 years from now, I really think we're going to be able to see a lot more digitally based solving out applications. I think, when we look at it down the road from now, we're going to be able to put on a virtual reality glass that's going to be able to capture the work environment, that's going to be able to put it into a digital environment that we can place a robot out there and say, hey, this component needs to get assembled this way, this component needs to go from point A, have a process done to it, and it's going to eventually hit point B. That entire area, I think, is going to be done digitally.
That's interesting. There's an old adage, people are optimistic about timeframes from 3 to 5 years and pessimistic about timeframes from 10 or so. So yeah. I think you're probably right.
Yeah, and so that's the one thing I would see. The other crystal ball that I will look for in the next 5 years, it was interesting listening to Alex's report and at the A3 Business Forum last week as well, right? 2024 was slow. They're saying 2025, Q1, Q2 is going to be slowish as well, but things will pick up for the next 3 to 4 years. I think the one really big thing that needs to happen is what China does really well is they integrated 135, and I'm sure you've traveled, right? They integrated 135 or 140,000 robots last year. The United States, I think, did like 41,000 or something like that. I think there needs to be if there's a better incentive coming from the U.S. government on why you should be integrating, I think that's where the changes are going to happen. So we'll see if the current administration, now that they're in office, if they can hurt or hinder more robots.
Sure. Ben, what do you see as the biggest trend shaping the industry over the next decade?
Instead of a crystal ball, can I be you're the genie and I have 3 wishes?
Sure,
my wishes
please.
For the 10
years.
I love that. Yeah. Predicting the future is really hard, and then if people look back at the record, inevitably I'm going to be wrong. So I'd love to just say what I wish for manufacturing. So maybe a little story to start. So I was in Tokyo last week, and one of my hosts, said he was going to bring me to one of the most advanced small and medium factories that they had around that kind of demonstrated some of the big ideas, which I was very excited because normally when I'm here, I ask people to show me the most, what they see as the most advanced factory in their region. And what was really interesting as a trend within this factory, so they're a high wage area in parts of Japan are also going to a 4-day work week. So the question for them was, how do we compete with a high wage workforce on a shortened work week? With our Chinese competitors, they're making medical devices and semiconductor equipment. And their solution was, rather than buy machines from a vendor, let's try to produce them ourselves for just the types of tasks that we need to perform internally. So absolutely like baseline open source machine building. And they did it for 1/4 of the price. They could get the machines from their Japanese vendors. And that was how they competed, was they essentially had internal machine building skills. They immediately, since they had built the machines, they knew how to maintain them and fix them much more quickly than they'd get a vendor to come in and fix them. And they could pay high wages, but because they had such lower capital costs, they were still competing at volume. And it was really extraordinary. And what it reminded me of is some of the labs, the most exciting labs I find at MIT, which are machine building labs. And there's this skill of people building open source machinery that's highly flexible, that can be updated along with the software that helps run it, and is a skill that is currently very scarce. But my hope from Chris the Genie here would be that becomes the real abundant skill in American manufacturing in particular over time, the skill to build and develop your own machining systems and your own cells internally, and that's one way that you compete because you can do that much less expensively than relying on vendors, domestic or foreign.
Granted, next wish.
Thank you.
Do you have any more?
I need to say, I'm going to stay there for now.
Okay, that sounds good. And just to reiterate, guys, I think you've mentioned it, but I want to be very clear. Over the next 10 years, what are the most important policy or educational gaps that need to be addressed to prepare the workforce?
You want to start?
After you.
Okay. I mean, for me, just my personal passion is we need to reach the younger generation as quickly as possible. So I guess my call to action would be is if you're a manufacturer, if you're a supplier of sorts, and you're not directly engaged with your local community, that's where things need to start. Manufacturing, 98.6% of manufacturers are small to medium-sized businesses that are within local communities that 80% of their employment is pulled in from a 30-mile radius of where their company is headquartered at. If you as a manufacturer are having a labor force issue and you're not directly involved with the education and the high schools that are educating and pushing out that future labor force, that's where you should be starting.
I want to speak to the policy side of this. So clearly there's sort of an arms race when it comes to new semiconductor fabs and chips facilities, and there's been kind of the IRA component with batteries, and a lot of that's been built around the idea that there are certain critical technologies that the US should be fluent in, and then maybe we can buy the components for those technologies from elsewhere. I think that's a wrong-headed set of policy principles, that we don't really know what the next critical technologies are going to be or what components are required to build them effectively. Like, we can't build magnets in the US anymore. Magnets are actually really critical to building batteries and building other technologies. Like, we're going to need to do component level stuff really, really well if we really want to have resilient supply chains. So then, if that's not the right paradigm, what is? I think back to the most important, government intervention probably in American history for manufacturing, which was at the beginning of the Second World War, before the United States was in on it. The US just changed the amortization calculus for manufacturers in the tax code. The DoD did that, and then William Knudsen, and it unleashed the biggest investment in new factory construction, because essentially these manufacturers could write it off over a shorter period, and it would get guaranteed after the war. All new equipment, it like supercharged the machine tool industry, greenfield factories, and all sorts of opportunity to adopt new technology and be at a higher productivity level than they could. They just relied on old automotive factories, for example. So what's the key there? It's de-risking manufacturing investment and de-risking experimentation. And I think that's what the government can still do. And the biggest tool for that is still the Department of Defense. Yeah. I don't want a war to be required to mobilize American industrial might again, right? I think there are ways through acquisition and through other Defense Department programs to de-risk investments in new manufacturing. And you might think, well, it's only defense contractors that could benefit from that. Well, in our research, about 40% of all SMEs have some relationship with the defense supply chain. So that could have huge far and wide impact if the Defense Department helped de-risk investment in greenfield factories.
Super interesting, yeah. Okay, guys, closing thoughts. Jake, I want you to leave us with a story. So you talk often about the importance of storytelling in manufacturing. Can you just share one brief story that highlights the automation's positive impact on a community or company?
Man, can I just run up the story I shared earlier?
Sure, yeah.
I mean, so that's basically just to reiterate. When you look at changes that can happen in the manufacturing space, it's one of those things where if you enable your employees to go out and make changes, that's where a lot of positive opportunities are going to go out there. So when you have the young kid, part of the first robotics team, go out, get a tour of a manufacturing facility, and say, I can do those robots and deploy them. It's an incredible thing. So, the one thing that when I talk to a lot of manufacturing companies that are out there is you hear more and more stories of the more robots that they deploy, the more people they were able to hire, the more they were able to grow. And that's what Ben said earlier, that robots and automation are truly what is making companies competitive on a global scale. And so if you're able to go out there and deploy successfully automation solutions and robotic solutions, that's what's going to help the company grow. And a lot of times it's being driven by a young, very ambitious, millennial and Gen Z labor force.
Yep, cool. Ben, the question to you is, your center focuses on taking very complex subjects and making them actionable through policy or whatever else. So what advice would you give to anyone looking to navigate the latest technologies and buzzwords?
I don't really have a good answer for that one. Can I answer the previous question?
Sure, yeah, go ahead and answer that, yeah.
So maybe navigating the previous, I'll try to answer your question and maybe end with a story.
Yeah.
So we have, and I'm not sure whether it was the wisest decision, but we have been studying, my colleagues and I, the impacts of robots on workers and trying to understand patterns of automation for a while. And about 18 months ago, with the release of GPT-3 and kind of this frenzy around generative AI, we wanted to understand, hey, is this going to be a similar story around obstacles to automation, workforce issues? And as we started to study this in large companies, how they were deploying generative AI, we realized, yeah, there were actually a lot of similarities. It's really hard to automate out work. It's really hard to codify skilled work in a machine. And as we started studying this, everyone asked us, like, well, what are the skills required to thrive in an AI-enabled or AI-augmented environment? And I think the best answer we have thus far is the skill of interpretation, to be able to interpret the data that the machine gives you and to understand what's high quality and how something can be made better. And that's the same skill that was important for the previous generation of technologies too. So those core skills seem still important. It doesn't seem like you need to totally throw out the old curriculum to succeed in this new environment. And then just kind of speaking of this curriculum question, I know, I'm not sure if you've been there, Chris, but one of the most inspiring places for me around American manufacturing is in eastern Kentucky in a town called Paintsville, a place called ECAMI, Eastern Kentucky Advanced Manufacturing Institute. So I love what they're doing, and I think that what they've proved, so for those of you who might not be familiar, the Eastern Kentucky Advanced Manufacturing Institute was set up as a partnership between a local entrepreneur, Kathy Walker, and Haas, which Haas has these regional training centers all across the country. This is the only one where there really isn't much manufacturing employment because this is in the middle of Appalachia and coal country. But what Kathy Walker did was she had this vision that the local community who had maybe been displaced from coal mining or who had come out of poverty or out of addiction, that they had these inherent mechanical skills and no one really had trusted them to develop them or found a good path to employment for them. So what she did was that she assembled a number of employers in central Kentucky. She didn't allow any employers in who were offering less than $25 an hour. So she was ensuring that these would be good jobs with upwardly mobile paths. And then she recruited from the local community and brought them really through what was like a military boot camp for machining. There's a former National Guardsman who's the head instructor. And at every quarter they graduate a new class, 100% employment rate, good jobs at places like Lockheed, large, in some cases foreign-owned companies that have really high standards for their skilled workers. And what they do, when they had these graduation ceremonies, I went to one not long ago, they have Kleenex boxes throughout the auditorium because everyone, the graduates, comes up and tells their story about the hardships in their life and how, in many cases, manufacturing saved them. This was a path to a much better life, a job that was better than they ever could have imagined. And that was, for me, is a reminder of why this is such an important industry to be a part of, and that it connects the legacy of manufacturing as a source of upward mobility and really what built the American middle class. So I love remembering that. And the question then for us is, like, how do we replicate that story over and over again throughout the country?
Very good. Well, guys, that's all the time we have for today. This episode of the Reautomated Podcast will be available on Apple Music and Spotify. We will reference these guys' websites as well as the recent articles that we were talking about from Ben in the show notes. Be sure to check that out. And once again, thank you, Jake Hall and Ben Armstrong, for joining us today. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks so much.
Yeah, good fun.
Hey, thanks so much, Chris.
That's great.
So where are you off to now? Back to Boston?